The moment the WNBA All-Star voting numbers started circulating, social media didn't just react, it detonated. Within minutes, timelines were flooded with disbelief, heated debates, and trending hashtags questioning how the league's most talked-about rookie sensation could be trailing in a fan-driven popularity race that was supposed to reflect pure momentum. Screenshots of early vote tallies spread like wildfire, each repost adding fuel to a growing storm that felt bigger than basketball itself. At the center of it all was Caitlin Clark, a name that has dominated headlines, shattered broadcast records, and turned every arena she steps into a national event. And yet, as the latest All-Star voting update surfaced, fans noticed something they weren't prepared for: Clark wasn't leading. That single detail was enough to send the conversation into chaos. Some fans called it unbelievable, others called it proof of bias, while a loud section of the internet insisted it was simply how voting works. But reason didn't matter in the moment, emotion did. And emotion was running high. Clips of Clark's deep threes, record-breaking college-to-pro transition, and sold-out WNBA crowds were reposted alongside polls asking one simple question: how is she not number one? Meanwhile, rival fanbases pushed back just as hard, pointing out veteran stars with years of league impact, championship resumes, and loyal regional support bases that don't always show up in viral social media metrics. The clash wasn't just about one player anymore. It had turned into a larger argument about legacy versus hype, experience versus momentum, and what all-star really means in a league suddenly under a global spotlight. Even analysts were pulled into the noise, trying to separate statistical reality from emotional reaction, but every attempt only seemed to add more tension. Every explanation triggered another counter-argument. Every chart sparked another debate thread. And just when it looked like the conversation might settle, a new wave of voting updates dropped, shifting rankings again, reshuffling expectations, and reigniting the outrage all over again. Because in this all-star race, nothing is stable, nothing is final, and the biggest shock might still be waiting right around the corner. The WNBA All-Star voting controversy didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the result of a much bigger shift happening inside women's basketball right now, a shift that has been building for years but has suddenly exploded into mainstream attention in the last 2 seasons. To understand why fans reacted so strongly when Caitlin Clark award or recognition she is part of instantly turns into a discussion about the future of the sport itself. But the WNBA All-Star voting system is not designed around hype alone. It is a blend of fan voting, player input, and media evaluation, a structure meant to balance popularity with respect among peers and basketball analysts. And this is where tension often begins. Because fan voting, especially in the social media era, is heavily influenced by visibility. Players who trend more frequently, appear in highlight reels, or generate constant online discussion often gain a massive advantage. On the other hand, veteran players with long careers, consistent performance, and deep respect within the league may not always dominate online conversations in the same way. This creates a natural conflict between two worlds, the digital spotlight and the internal basketball ecosystem. In Clark's case, she exists at the intersection of both worlds. She is not only a rookie but also one of the most marketable and recognizable athletes in the entire league. Her presence has boosted ticket sales, increased television ratings, and drawn unprecedented attention to regular season games that previously struggled to attract national audiences. For many fans, she represents a new era, fast-paced, fearless, and highly visible. So when voting updates suggest she is not leading the pack, it feels to a large portion of the audience like something doesn't match the narrative they are seeing every day on their screens. That emotional disconnect is what fuels outrage. People are not just reacting to numbers, they are reacting to expectations shaped by constant exposure. At the same time, it is important to understand the perspective of other fanbases and players within the league. The WNBA is filled with established stars who have built their reputations over years of consistent excellence. Players who have carried franchises through rebuilding phases, delivered playoff performances, won championships, and earned respect through longevity rather than viral fame. To these supporters, all-star voting is not a popularity contest, it is a recognition of sustained excellence. They argue that the league cannot ignore years of contribution just because a newer player has generated a sudden surge in attention. For them, Clark's rise is impressive, but it exists within a much larger ecosystem of talent that should not be overshadowed by hype alone. This is where the debate becomes emotionally charged. It is no longer just about basketball performance. It becomes a conversation about fairness, recognition, generational change, and even the identity of the league itself. Another layer to this situation is the unprecedented media amplification surrounding Clark's career. In previous eras, even the most popular WNBA players did not receive this level of constant national coverage. But now, every statistic, every highlight, every ranking update is instantly broadcast across social platforms, sports shows, and fan accounts. This means any perceived snub or unexpected result becomes magnified into a viral controversy within hours. The all-star voting process, which in earlier years might have passed with minimal attention, is now under a microscope. Every leaderboard update is analyzed, dissected, and debated in real time. Meanwhile, players themselves are also navigating this new reality. Many veterans have openly acknowledged the increased attention the league is receiving and have expressed both excitement and caution about it. On one hand, the growth is undeniable: higher attendance, bigger sponsorships, and mainstream recognition. On the other hand, the rapid shift has created pressure, comparison culture, and constant public scrutiny that did not exist at this scale before. Coaches and analysts often find themselves trying to bridge the gap between performance evaluation and public perception. A player's value in basketball terms does not always match their popularity score, and the all-star voting system sits directly in the middle of that tension. What makes this particular situation even more intense is the timing. The league is in a growth phase where every headline matters. Every controversy becomes part of a larger narrative about how women's basketball is evolving. And when a figure like Caitlin Clark is involved, someone who already represents change, attention, and disruption, even a routine voting update can turn into a national talking point. The result is a perfect storm: rising global interest, a new generation of superstar talent, deeply loyal fan bases, and a voting system that blends multiple perspectives into one ranking that everyone interprets differently. So when the numbers don't align with expectations, it doesn't stay a simple sports update. It becomes a cultural debate. And as this all-star voting race continues to unfold, one thing is already clear: the conversation is no longer just about who gets selected, it's about what the future of the league looks like and who gets to define it. As the all-star voting race tightened, what began as casual fan debate quickly hardened into something far more intense: a full-blown conflict between perception, performance, and power inside the WNBA ecosystem. At first, the numbers seemed like routine fluctuations. Voting updates in any all-star process usually shift daily as fan campaigns push their favorite players up the leaderboard. But this time, the reaction was different. Every update involving Caitlin Clark wasn't just noticed, it was dissected, reposted, and argued over in real time. And when one of the midweek releases showed her still not sitting where most casual viewers expected, the tone of the conversation changed completely. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was confrontation. Fans began organizing online voting drives, urging others to correct the rankings. Hashtags started trending across platforms, not just supporting Clark but directly challenging the legitimacy of the results. The language became sharper, more emotional, and increasingly divided. Some posts framed it as a simple popularity contest gone wrong. Others framed it as a sign of deeper resistance within the league toward a player who had rapidly reshaped its visibility. On the opposite side, supporters of veteran stars pushed back just as hard. They pointed to consistency, defensive impact, leadership roles, and championship experience, arguing that all-star recognition should not be driven by viral popularity spikes. In their view, Clark's surge in attention, while historic, should not automatically override years of established excellence from other players. This created a digital battlefield where every highlight clip turned into ammunition for one side or the other. A Clark deep three wasn't just a basketball moment anymore, it became evidence in a larger argument about dominance. A veteran's clutch performance wasn't just a win, it became a counterpoint to hype culture. But the real turning point came when a second voting update dropped. This time, the reshuffling wasn't minor. A cluster of veteran guards surged unexpectedly, while Clark's position appeared to stall relative to the momentum many assumed she would carry. The change itself was not necessarily dramatic in statistical terms, but the perception of it was explosive. Screenshots of before and after rankings spread instantly, with fans zooming in on every shift as if decoding a hidden message. Within minutes, the narrative transformed from "she's behind" to "something is happening." That's when the first major twist entered the conversation, not from the league, not from officials, but from the fans themselves. A viral post claimed that coordinated anti-Clark voting blocks were forming among rival fan bases, encouraging supporters of other teams to collectively push specific players up the leaderboard to counteract her influence. Whether or not the claim had any structured basis didn't matter. The idea alone was enough to ignite chaos. Suddenly, the debate wasn't just about popularity or performance anymore. It became about strategy, about manipulation, about whether all-star voting could be gamed in the social media era the same way trends, hashtags, and viral campaigns can be engineered. This theory spread like wildfire. Threads appeared breaking down alleged voting patterns, comparing regional fan engagement spikes, and analyzing sudden jumps in certain players' numbers. People began treating the leaderboard like a puzzle instead of a reflection of fan preference. Every movement was interpreted as intentional. Every shift was suspicious. Every update became evidence of a larger unseen battle. And right in the center of that storm stood Caitlin Clark. Her presence amplified everything. If another player had been in her position, the reaction might have been contained. But because she represents such a massive cultural force, a player whose every performance is already magnified by media attention, even small deviations in voting felt like major events. As the online arguments escalated, traditional sports media stepped in to try to stabilize the conversation. Analysts emphasized that all-star voting is not a linear projection of best player rankings, but a multi-layered system influenced by fan enthusiasm, media narratives, and player reputation within the league. But that explanation only partially worked. Because the real conflict was not statistical, it was emotional. For Clark supporters, the expectation was simple: visibility equals dominance. If she is the most talked-about player, she should naturally be leading or near the top. Anything else feels like a contradiction in the modern sports attention economy. For her critics and neutral observers, the situation was more complex. They pointed out that attention does not always equal superiority, and that the league has multiple elite players whose contributions cannot be measured by highlight volume alone. This clash of definitions, what deserves means, became the core of the conflict. Then came the second twist, and it hit even harder than the first. A leaked internal discussion snippet began circulating online, allegedly showing debates among basketball commentators and media voters about how to balance impact versus popularity in this year's selections. While its authenticity was never confirmed, the content appeared to suggest that some voters were consciously trying to weigh Clark's unprecedented popularity against established league hierarchy. To fans already on edge, this was gasoline on fire. The reaction was immediate. Many interpreted it as proof that the system itself was conflicted about her rise, not rejecting her, but struggling to categorize her within traditional frameworks. Others saw it as bias in action, arguing that no other player has ever been subjected to such visible balancing discussions in public discourse. The result was a complete breakdown of trust in interpretation. No one could agree on what the numbers meant anymore. Every angle had a counter-angle. Every argument had an opposing explanation. Meanwhile, players themselves remained largely silent publicly, but social media activity from fan accounts, commentators, and retired athletes added layers of indirect commentary. Some praised the competitiveness of the voting race, calling it a sign of the league's growth. Others warned that the discourse was becoming toxic and overshadowing on-court performance. Behind the scenes, however, one undeniable reality was forming: the All-Star vote was no longer just a popularity metric. It had become a referendum on the league's identity during its fastest period of transformation in decades. And as the second wave of rankings settled, one thing was clear: the conflict was no longer contained within sports media. It had become cultural. And the first real twist had already set the stage for something much bigger coming next. As the All-Star voting debate intensified, what had started as a rankings discussion began to evolve into something far more volatile, a situation where every new update felt less like routine data and more like a trigger for another wave of public outrage. By this stage, the conversation around Caitlin Clark had completely outgrown the original context of All-Star selection. It was no longer just about where she stood on a leaderboard. It had become a symbol of how the WNBA was changing in real time, and whether the league, its voters, its fans, and its internal culture was fully aligned with that change. The escalation began with another official voting update. This one didn't just shift positions, it reshaped the entire narrative again. Several players experienced unexpected surges, while Clark's position remained a point of fixation for fans tracking every movement. Even minor differences in vote totals were treated like seismic events. Screenshots circulated instantly, with social media users highlighting fractions of change as if they were major turning points. And with every update, the tone became sharper. Fans who believed Clark was being undervalued doubled down on claims that something systematic was influencing the outcome. They pointed to sudden jumps in other players' votes as too coordinated, arguing that the timing of changes didn't match normal fan behavior patterns. On the other side, critics dismissed these claims as paranoia fueled by viral fandom culture, insisting that the numbers simply reflected broader league-wide support for multiple stars. But what made this stage different was not just disagreement, it was amplification. Sports media shows began dedicating entire segments to the controversy. Analysts debated whether the all-star voting system needed reform, while former players weighed in with mixed reactions. Some emphasized that the league finally had enough depth for multiple stars to shine simultaneously, arguing that Clark's presence should not overshadow established talent. Others acknowledged that her impact on visibility was unprecedented and naturally altering how fans engage with the league. However, even these discussions began to spiral into meta-debates about bias, marketing, and narrative control. Then came the moment that pushed everything into full escalation mode. A second viral leak surfaced online, this time far more specific and far more divisive in its interpretation. The post claimed to show a behind-the-scenes conversation among marketing and media stakeholders discussing how Clark's popularity was reshaping engagement metrics across the league, and how that influence might indirectly affect how narratives around voting were being framed publicly. The key issue wasn't whether the content was verified. It was how people interpreted it. To some, it sounded like proof that Clark's rise was disrupting traditional structures in ways even insiders were still trying to understand. To others, it sounded like evidence that external forces, media framing, promotional strategies, and engagement-driven storytelling were now deeply entangled with how fans perceived legitimacy in the voting process. Within hours, the alleged leak had been dissected across platforms. Every line was analyzed, every phrase was debated, and every possible implication was expanded into threads, videos, and reaction breakdowns. The story mutated with each repost, becoming less about what was actually said and more about what people believed it meant. At this point, the situation crossed a critical threshold. Broadcast ratings and national attention should naturally translate into overwhelming all-star recognition. They framed her position in the voting race as a reflection of resistance to change rather than objective evaluation. Opposing voices argued the exact opposite. They insisted that the league could not collapse all evaluation into popularity metrics, warning that doing so would erase years of player development, defensive excellence, and championship pedigree from meaningful recognition. Both sides believed they were defending fairness. Both sides believed they were protecting the integrity of the league. And that is what made the conflict so difficult to contain. Meanwhile, the league itself remained measured in its public communications, reiterating the structure of the voting system and encouraging fans to continue participating. But official statements had little effect on the momentum of online discourse. If anything, they often intensified speculation, as fans interpreted neutral language through their own existing assumptions. As the escalation continued, another layer emerged: player perception. Although most athletes avoided direct commentary, subtle reactions began appearing in interviews and post-game discussions. Some veteran players emphasized team performance over individual spotlight, indirectly reinforcing the idea that attention does not equal dominance. Others acknowledged the excitement surrounding new fan engagement and the increased visibility the league was experiencing. These carefully worded responses were immediately picked apart online, with fans interpreting tone, phrasing, and body language as hidden signals about the voting controversy. At this point, even silence became part of the narrative. Then came the shocking reveal moment that shifted everything again: not a new ranking update, not a statement from the league, but an unexpected statistical breakdown shared by a sports analytics account that caught massive attention. The breakdown showed that while Clark's overall vote total remained extremely high, her distribution pattern across regions and voting waves was unusually volatile compared to previous top all-star finishers. In simple terms, her support was massive but uneven, surging dramatically in certain voting windows while stabilizing or slowing in others. This analysis immediately sparked a new wave of interpretation. Some fans saw it as confirmation that coordinated voting surges, both for and against, were actively shaping the leaderboard. Others saw it as a normal byproduct of unprecedented attention levels and viral engagement cycles. Analysts attempted to explain it in terms of modern digital fan behavior, where spikes in visibility often lead to burst-driven voting rather than steady accumulation. But regardless of explanation, the effect was the same: it deepened the mystery. Now, instead of arguing about who should be ahead, people were asking why the pattern itself looked so unusual. And that question opened the door to even more speculation. Because once fans start analyzing patterns instead of outcomes, the conversation stops being about basketball alone, and starts becoming about systems, influence, and hidden dynamics that most viewers never think about during a normal season. By the end of this escalation phase, the all-star voting race had transformed into something far larger than anyone anticipated. It was no longer just a popularity contest or a recognition system. It had become a mirror reflecting the entire tension inside modern women's basketball, between tradition and transformation, between legacy and virality, and between how the game is played on the court and how it is interpreted by millions watching from outside it. And with the final voting update still ahead, the biggest shock of all still felt like it hadn't arrived yet. As the All-Star voting controversy continued to intensify, the conversation finally broke out of pure fan circles and into a wider public arena where players, coaches, analysts, former legends, and mainstream media all began reacting in real time. What had started as a leaderboard discussion was now a full-scale industry moment, one that everyone inside basketball felt pressured to comment on, even indirectly. The first wave of reactions came from analysts and broadcasters, who found themselves in an unusual position. On one hand, they had to acknowledge the unprecedented attention Caitlin Clark was bringing to the WNBA. On the other hand, they also had to defend the integrity of the voting process, which historically balanced popularity with respect from peers and media. Some analysts framed the situation as a transition moment for the league. They argued that what fans were witnessing wasn't controversy in a negative sense, but evolution. The WNBA, in their view, was entering a phase where traditional measurement systems were colliding with modern digital fandom. In that environment, they said, unexpected voting outcomes were not only possible, they were inevitable. Others were less philosophical and more direct. They pointed out that all-star voting has always contained surprises, and that emotional reactions often exaggerate short-term fluctuations. In their analysis, Clark's position in the rankings still reflected extremely strong support, just not the kind of unanimous dominance some fans assumed would naturally occur. But even these measured takes struggled to calm the online storm. Because by now, the controversy was no longer about statistics. It was about identity. Former players added another layer to the discussion, and their reactions were especially influential. Many veterans expressed respect for Clark's impact on the league's visibility, acknowledging that she had brought a new audience into women's basketball at a scale rarely seen before. They spoke about increased attendance, higher broadcast ratings, and a renewed global interest in the WNBA ecosystem. However, they also emphasized something equally important: longevity and consistency matter. From their perspective, all-star recognition is not only about who is trending at the moment, but also about who has sustained excellence across seasons, playoff runs, and leadership roles within their teams. They argued that while Clark's rise was historic, the league still contained players who had carried franchises for years without the same level of spotlight. This dual perspective created an interesting tension even among former athletes. Some openly supported Clark's inclusion at the very top of fan voting, saying her influence on the sport was undeniable. Others cautioned against rewriting evaluation standards too quickly, warning that overcorrecting for popularity could undermine competitive balance. Meanwhile, current players largely stayed cautious in their public comments. Most avoided naming individuals directly, but their general remarks about competition, respect, and league growth were closely analyzed by fans searching for hidden meaning. Even a simple quote about earning recognition through consistency or appreciating the depth of talent in the league was interpreted through the lens of the ongoing voting debate. Coaches, too, were drawn into the conversation in post-game interviews. Many attempted to steer discussions back toward team performance, but journalists frequently redirected questions toward the all-star race. Some coaches praised the increased attention the league was receiving, while others subtly expressed concern that off-court narratives were beginning to overshadow on-court execution. This created a layered media environment where almost every answer felt like it carried secondary meaning. Sports media networks amplified the situation even further. Debate shows dedicated segments to analyzing whether the WNBA needed to reconsider its voting structure. Should fan voting carry more weight? Should media votes be adjusted to reflect modern engagement metrics? Should the system evolve to better reflect digital-era popularity? Each proposed solution sparked new disagreement. Online communities, meanwhile, became more segmented and intense. Clark supporters created coordinated voting reminders, countdowns, and engagement campaigns encouraging maximum participation. They treated every update like a mission, framing the voting process as something requiring collective effort. Opposing fanbases responded with equal organization, encouraging their own voting participation for veteran stars and emphasizing recognition for long-term contributors to the league. What emerged was not just competition between players, but competition between communities. The discourse even spilled into mainstream entertainment and general sports commentary outside of basketball. Influencers, podcasts, and cultural commentators began weighing in, often framing the situation as part of a broader conversation about how fame, influence, and performance interact in modern sports ecosystems. Some argued that Clark represented a new era of athlete visibility, where impact is measured not only by wins and stats but also by cultural reach. Others warned that this kind of framing risks turning competitive sports into popularity-driven entertainment contests rather than performance-based recognition systems. Amid all this, one of the most interesting developments was the growing recognition that the WNBA itself was benefiting from the attention, even if the conversation felt chaotic. Television ratings saw spikes during key games involving Clark. Social media engagement for league content surged. Merchandise interest increased across multiple teams. For league executives, this was a complicated but undeniably positive trend. The league was receiving levels of mainstream attention it had never consistently experienced before. However, this success also came with pressure. Every controversial moment now carried amplified weight, and every discussion about fairness or voting integrity became part of a larger narrative about how the league manages growth. In internal discussions referenced by analysts, there was a growing awareness that the league had entered a high-visibility era, where fan engagement could no longer be separated from competitive narratives. Everything was connected: performance, popularity, media framing, and digital discourse. As reactions continued to pour in, one theme became increasingly clear: there was no single unified interpretation of what was happening. To some, the voting race was proof of Clark's transformative impact on the sport. To others, it was a reminder that basketball excellence must be evaluated beyond hype cycles. To analysts, it was a case study in modern sports media dynamics. To fans, it was personal, emotional, and deeply tied to loyalty. And in the middle of all these perspectives, the league itself stood as both the subject of celebration and the center of controversy. By the end of this reaction wave, the situation had fully stabilized into something permanent, not just a debate, but a defining storyline of the season. And with final voting results still unfolding, everyone knew one thing for certain: whatever came next would not fade quietly into the background. As the final wave of all-star voting updates approached, the tension surrounding the rankings had reached a point where every refresh of the leaderboard felt like a global event. Fans weren't just checking numbers anymore, they were refreshing feeds like breaking news alerts, expecting something dramatic, something definitive, something that would finally settle weeks of argument. But instead of resolution, what came next delivered something far more complicated. The last official update before the voting window closed showed a tightened race across multiple positions, with several players clustered in ranges so close that even small late surges could completely alter the final outcome. Caitlin Clark's position remained one of the most closely watched elements of the entire board, not because of a single number, but because of what that number represented: momentum, influence, and expectation all colliding in real time. And then, something unusual happened. A sudden spike in engagement data appeared across multiple platforms tied to WNBA voting content. In the final hours, mentions, shares, and voting-related posts surged far beyond what had been recorded in previous windows. Analysts tracking real-time trends noted that this wasn't a gradual increase, it was a sharp, almost synchronized wave of activity that didn't match typical voting behavior patterns. At first, it looked like a late fan push. A classic final-hour surge that happens in many all-star systems. But the scale was different. Far larger. Far more concentrated. And oddly distributed across regions that hadn't previously dominated voting activity. Within minutes, social media lit up again. Some users claimed this was proof of a massive coordinated effort to influence final rankings. Others insisted it was simply the natural result of global attention reaching peak intensity at the deadline. But the timing, so precise, so compressed, made the explanation feel less certain than ever. As speculation grew, a second detail emerged that shifted the conversation again. A respected analytics account posted a breakdown showing that several players experienced statistically unusual last-hour increases that didn't align with their earlier voting trajectories. The post didn't make accusations, but its tone was enough to spark immediate interpretation wars. Some saw it as evidence of organized fan mobilization. Others saw it as a predictable outcome of viral amplification in the final voting window. But the damage was already done. The narrative had fractured completely. In one version of the story, the final surge represented the power of modern fandom, global audiences uniting in real time to support their favorite players. In another version, it represented a system being pushed to its limits by digital coordination, where visibility and timing mattered as much as genuine preference. And in the middle of both interpretations stood Caitlin Clark, whose name continued to dominate discussion threads, highlight debates, and prediction posts right up until the final seconds of voting. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the closure of the voting window. For a brief period, everything went quiet. No updates. No shifts. No movement. Just anticipation. And then the final results began to surface. But instead of delivering clarity, the announcement created something entirely different: confusion layered over shock. Because while some expected outcomes aligned with predictions, Others didn't match the narrative that had dominated the entire debate. Several players saw unexpected placements that immediately triggered fresh waves of reaction. And once again, the focus of global attention snapped back toward the most closely watched name on the board. The final ranking showed Caitlin Clark in a position that immediately reignited every argument that had defined the controversy from the very beginning. Too high for some, too low for others, and impossible to separate from the emotional build-up that had surrounded her from the start. Within seconds, social media erupted. But this time, the reaction wasn't just outrage or celebration. It was disbelief. Because the issue wasn't only where she landed, it was how the final distribution of votes looked when viewed as a whole. The patterns that analysts had been debating suddenly took on a new meaning in hindsight. The surges, the clusters, the late spikes, everything now appeared like pieces of a puzzle that could be interpreted in multiple conflicting ways depending on perspective. And just as commentators began breaking down the results live on air, a final unexpected detail emerged that shifted everything again. A post from within a league-affiliated digital account briefly went live before being deleted within minutes. It referenced unprecedented engagement levels and record-breaking participation across platforms, but what caught attention wasn't the celebratory tone. It was a single line mentioning that the 2026 All-Star voting cycle had introduced new challenges in measuring real-time fan behavior. The post disappeared quickly, but screenshots spread faster. And that was enough. Because now, the conversation wasn't just about who made the All-Star team. It was about whether the system itself had been pushed into a new era, one where traditional voting logic might no longer fully capture how fans engage with the league. As analysts scrambled to respond and fans dissected every angle of the final rankings, one truth became unavoidable: nothing about this voting cycle had behaved like previous years. Not the speed of the debates. Not the intensity of the reactions. Not the volatility of the rankings. And certainly not the way a single player's presence seemed to amplify every layer of the conversation around her. But even with all the data, analysis, and reaction combined, one question still hung in the air without an answer. Was this simply the biggest all-star voting moment in WNBA history? Or the beginning of a completely new system where influence, attention, and competition were no longer separate forces? And as the dust began to settle on the final rankings, the league and its fans were left staring at a reality that felt far from settled. Because something about this year's vote didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a turning point. As the dust settles on one of the most heated all-star voting cycles in recent memory, one thing is impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a list of names, it was a snapshot of where the league is right now and where it might be heading next. Every update, every spike, every argument revealed something bigger than basketball stats. It showed how deeply fans are now connected to the WNBA, how quickly narratives form, and how fast a single leaderboard can turn into a global conversation. Caitlin Clark's presence in the middle of it all only amplified that reality, not because of one number on a chart, but because of the way she has changed attention itself around the league. Some fans will walk away convinced the system reflects fairness and depth, that the WNBA has more stars than ever, and competition for all-star spots has never been stronger. Others will leave feeling like the voting process still struggles to balance popularity, legacy, and performance in a way that satisfies everyone. And maybe that disagreement is exactly the point. Because the moment a league becomes this visible, this debated, and this emotionally charged, it stops being just about games played on the court. It becomes about identity, who represents the league's present, who defines its future, and how fans themselves shape that story in real time. Now the conversation doesn't end here. It continues in every comment section, every highlight reel, every debate show, and every fan discussion that follows. The rankings may be final on paper, but the opinions are still evolving, still clashing, still expanding into something bigger than a single voting cycle. And as the next WNBA events approach, one question lingers louder than all the rest. Is this the new normal for women's basketball, where every vote, every performance, and every moment can ignite a global reaction within minutes? Or is this just the beginning of something even bigger that fans haven't fully seen yet? One thing is certain, the league isn't just being watched anymore. It's being debated, analyzed, and lived in real time. And the next chapter is already waiting to unfold.